Take a seat, please. We will soon get started. Notice on your chairs a handout about two important meetings you might want to plan to attend. Take those back home with you and remind you about those meetings. This morning is the second part in the series called White Christian Nationalism. It's our pleasure and privilege to have Jane Dickie, who has been long-term employee of Hope College in the psychology department and women's studies. 17 years as chair of women's studies? Mm-hmm. Yes. Take it away, Jane Dickie.
Thank you very much. I told Judy I felt safe because she was here, and the other colleague is Ken. And having those two folk here mean that it's going to be a great session because we'll all be able to hear it and see it, so it's good. Welcome to this second of our series brought to you by the Justice and Reconciliation Ministry. And clearly, it's a very timely topic we're dealing with here. Understanding white Christian nationalism. And as on your chairs was mentioned, there are two events coming up which we found scheduled after we had scheduled this. And so there are opportunities to continue to explore this issue and look at the ways in which it relates to our most immediate county commission and situation in West Michigan as well. Last week, for those of you who were here, we began to explore what is white Christian nationalism. And we looked at the definition of Christian nationalism and the roots in this ideology. And you filled out a questionnaire, which included 5 questions that defined from the Brookings study what white Christian nationalism is, how it's identified. And we'll get more to that in a little bit. Today, we're going to explore the racist historical context of white Christian nationalism, as well as the patriarchy and authoritarianism within Christian nationalism. And then next week, you'll bring it home and take a look at how this all relates to our current situation here in West Michigan. So let's first of all realize what we're doing here. We're trying to understand white Christian nationalism in order to face the harmful impacts that this can have on Christian faith and how we can, as Christians, move to build the beloved community given in Christ. So first of all, I think it's important to look at the takeaways from last week's presentation. And I've asked both Tom and Ron to just give a brief summary. So Tom, if you would just give a brief summary of what last week was about. I guess, you need to come and get us. Get yourself here, Tom. And Judy will find you. Excellent.
Well, you remember we talked about the long history that Hope Church has had in facing and trying to deal with, and find our call regarding tough issues in society, and we talked about the characteristics of white Christian nationalism and the risks that it poses for the church as a national body regarding what Christianity really is, and we talked about the need that we have to move beyond just thinking about this and to try to formulate a responsible, faithful action in response.
Ron, don't sit down. Come on up here. I'm clicking and it's not moving.
Okay.
There we go. Brief summary from Ron. What happened last week, Ron? Do you remember?
A lot of good things. I'm really very, very fortunate to be a member of this committee and a church that is interested in tackling difficult issues. And working with Tom, we put together the introduction to the course, and I briefly summarize the rise and the characteristics of white Christian nationalism in American history. And It is unfortunate that with the times of duress in the economy and increased political polarization, that a lot of these characteristics, including racism, nativism, sexism, and even now the rise of authoritarianism come to the fore. So we're ready to hear from another esteemed colleague this morning. Thanks, Jane.
Judy will take, thanks, Ron. So I wasn't here last week. I was, in fact, on a wine tour in Italy. So not only am I jet lagged, I'm wine lagged. So forgive me if my mind goes off a bit. But I did look at the video and was very impressed with what was presented. I also realized how insanely difficult it was to look at those statistics as they flew by. So without further ado, let's take a look first at what, and I'll get to the statistics, at what are those statements that constitute the Christian nationalism scale. So in any research, you define with a method what you're going to measure, and this is how Christian nationalism is defined, based on how much you agree with these 5 statements. And last week, the participants, you filled out your questionnaires on this. And I've put up here a comparison between the national sample from the Brookings Institute research and Hope Church participants by comparison. So you can see that God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. 20% of Americans agree with that. 2% of Hope Church participants last week agreed. The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. 27% versus 4%. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. 30% versus nobody of the participants. And the U.S. moves from Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore, 38% versus 4%. Interestingly, and this might lead to some interesting conversations, U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. Here is a place where hope comes closer to what the national average was, and it would be fun to talk about what we mean by U.S. laws should be based on Christian values, because there was a diversity across views on that one.
Just to clarify, that was 31%, not 31 people.
Yes, yes. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Those are percentages. 30, yeah. So the statistics that bombarded your heads last week, what correlates with beliefs in Christian nationalism? First of all, I think it's important to remember that of the American population, only 10% were strongly Christian nationalists. They were called adherents. And those were people that 100% agreed with those last 5 things, and not only agreed with them, but strongly agreed. Then there was another category that of people who were, what was the word used? Sympathizers. And those are people who tended to agree, but less likely strongly agree. The third were skeptics, and those were people who tended to disagree with those 5 statements, but not strongly disagree. And then you had the rejectors, who completely disagreed with all 5 of those statements. So Brookings goes on to look at what are the correlations between being in those categories and the other questions they asked. So first of all, a caution about correlations. How many of you had a statistics course ever in your life? Oh, fabulous. Okay, I won't give you a test now. But certainly, and it came up, one of you brought it up last week, correlation is not causation. A correlation just means that 2 variables tend to happen together, but it doesn't mean that one causes the other. So, for example, there was a strong correlation between identifying as an evangelical and being a Christian nationalist. Does being Christian nationalist cause you to be evangelical? Does being an evangelical cause you to be a Christian nationalist? Or possibly is neither of those true, but some third variable, like being raised in a rural community by loving parents who held very conservative evangelical and political views? You see what I mean? It could be a third thing altogether, that these aren't necessarily causing one another. Okay. For those of you who had statistics, bringing it all back for you. So the other thing to keep in mind is variability. So when I list the things that those statistics showed last time, what correlates with Christian nationalism, understand that it doesn't mean that every evangelical is going to be a Christian nationalist. In fact, I think it was something like 54% of evangelicals or something like that. When it says that being Republican, oh, that was for being Republican is more, people who are Christian nationalists are more likely to be Republican than Democrat. But there's overlap there, because although 54% of Christian nationalists identified as Republican, about 20% of Democrats did. So it's important to realize when we're looking at this that it doesn't mean that every Republican believes this or every Democrat believes that, or that every Christian nationalist is most trusting far-right, like, I don't even know the names of them, maybe you do, or Fox News. There tends to be a correlation with age. It's people over 50 who are more likely to be Christian nationalists than people under 50. And they tend to be less educated. And I know this came up before, and this is one of the beauties of a large data set, a beautiful 6,000 people that represent what America looks like. Because our personal experiences are one data point. But when you have 6,000 people across the range, it gives you a kind of a check on what your own personal experience is. So we know people who are highly educated who would identify as Christian nationalists. It also correlates with other views. Christian nationalists tend to believe that there is no structural racism. They tend to be more anti-immigrant, more anti-Muslim, hold more patriarchal gender roles, gender views, believe the United States is the promised land for European Christians, and slightly more likely to have used violence in the last few years. Okay, but majority of them, 70%, didn't use violence, but because Christian nationalists, 30% did, people who don't identify as Christian nationalists, it was only around 5%. So that's what correlation shows you. And then slightly more likely to support political violence. So now let's move on with that as a kind of a summary of all those statistics that hit you last time, with caveats that it doesn't mean everybody believes those things. There's great variability. So let's begin to take a look at the connection with whiteness and racism. With Tisby, who is one of the authors of two of the books that we're going to be reading for the October 29 Sunday school class. So after you hear him, you'll see you will run out there and get his book and join one of those groups. Okay.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name's Jemar. Why don't we each go around and introduce ourselves?
And all 1,500 people online.
Right.
Shout out to you coming out on a random Wednesday morning to hear about a light and fuzzy topic like Christian nationalism. It can be heavy. It can cause us to go like this and frown. But being together and learning and trying to do something about it makes me feel like smiling. So we're going to go on a journey. It's going to be okay. We're going to be dealing with some hard facts, but we'll do it together. How's that? All right. So with that preamble, let me make this statement. White Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to democracy and the witness of the church in the United States today. White Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to democracy and the witness of the church in the United States today. These data back it up. I define Christian nationalism as an ethno-cultural ideology that uses Christian symbolism to create a permission structure for the acquisition of political power and social control. An ethno-cultural ideology that uses Christian symbolism to create a permission structure for the acquisition of political power and social control. Lots of different definitions out there, many of them very good. That's just how I think of it. As we look at these most recent findings, one particular aspect stood out to me as a historian of race and religion, and it was this part. It says, there are minimal differences in adherence to Christian nationalism beliefs by race. Minimal differences. Rates of support for Christian nationalism are roughly the same among white Americans, about 30% lean, and black Americans, about 30% lean toward Christian nationalism. And I said, that's interesting, given the racial implications and ramifications of Christian nationalism. How could it be that there are minimal differences by race? And then I thought about it. Two things came up. One, there has always been some cooperation of the oppressed with the oppressor. This is how you get the trope of the Uncle Tom, right? It's the idea that you betray your own community and take sides with the dominant power. So that's always the case in whatever kind of oppression you're dealing with. But secondly, black Americans as a group are a highly religious group. On average, most Americans believe in God or a higher power. According to a Pew Research study in 2021, 97% of black Americans believe in God or a higher power. And the vast majority of those folks are Christian, Protestant at that. So it wouldn't surprise us that this language of God and country resonates with black people. The difference is, what do we mean? What do we mean by those words? I contrast white Christian nationalism with black Christian patriotism. Nationalism and patriotism. Let me give you one example. Last night, we heard the State of the Union, and if you had your caffeine going, you heard the response to the State of the Union from Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the new governor of Arkansas. She ran against Chris Jones, a black man with a PhD from MIT. What's so interesting about those two figures is that they both ran what I call faith-forward campaigns. They foregrounded their Christian faith. They're both children of preachers. They both adhere to Christianity. Chris Jones is a minister. And yet, what they meant when they looked at the intersection between faith and politics was very different. Just broadly speaking, when you talk about white Christian nationalism, it tends toward a rigid, narrow, authoritarian kind of politics. When you're talking about black Christian patriotism, it tends toward an expansive, flexible, inclusive kind of politics. And so, it's not just the words people use, it's the ramifications of what they mean by those words. Now, you've heard me say a couple of times white Christian nationalism. I think Christian nationalism is a perfectly appropriate term. It takes less time to say. But I don't want us to forget the white in the white Christian nationalism part. That is to say, we cannot overlook the racial dimensions of Christian nationalism. Dr. Jones pointed some of that out. I'll just remind us that as we see resurgence of what we're now calling white Christian nationalism, that tends to happen around times when black rights are expanded. So we can look at sort of the most notorious group that represents white Christian nationalism, and if you never thought of them in these terms, I think it'll be appropriate, the Ku Klux Klan. First arose in the 1860s. What happened then? Emancipation after the Civil War. They got real active again in the 1950s and 60s. What was going on then? A civil rights movement where black people were pushing for more civil rights. But perhaps the most widespread and virulent form happened in the Jim Crow era. What was going on then? Coincided in 1915 with this film, The Birth of a Nation, which mythologized and romanticized the founding of the Klan and of a white Christian, mainly Protestant America. So, in conclusion, white Christian nationalism is not only the greatest threat to democracy and the witness of the church in the United States today, to put a finer point on it, white Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to a multiracial, inclusive democracy and a diverse church in the United States today. Thank you. Thank you.
Alrighty, it seems that he said a couple of powerful things. I know that it was sometimes a little bit hard to hear, and somehow the words messed up at the top. But his greatest points were that white Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to Christianity and democracy today, that the use of Christian symbols is in service of an ideology that attempts to gain political power and social control. And then he went on talking about the comparison, why are there blacks that appear to be Christian nationalists as well? And he tried to make the distinction between a black patriotism, which is similar to the point that Ron was making last week too, I think, patriotism versus kind of a nationalism. So we're going to take a couple of minutes now for any kinds of thoughts or reactions on your part. So please feel free.
And be aware that this is being recorded.
Yeah, and announce your own name as you take the mic, please.
I'm David Alexander. As I listened and reflected on this last week during the presentation, I came to a tentative conclusion that the conquest of the Americas by white Europeans was going to happen anyway. That was a social and economic thing. And that someplace along the line, somebody decided to stick a cross in it and make that part of the whole thing too, to sort of baptize it. And what has happened with white Christian nationalism is the cross has been wrapped in the stars and stripes. And so the conquest, the invasion, whatever you want to call it, was going to happen anyway because of economics and history and politics. The cross being part of it was kind of a window dressing, and now it gets flags stuck on it. Thank you.
I'm Steve, and I'm curious. One of my college roommates at Hope, who will remain unnamed, let's just put it that way, has been posting frequently on LinkedIn about biblical citizenship. And I've not encountered that term previously, so I'm curious if anyone else has, and if you have, could you help us understand what the tenets of biblical citizenship are? His particular church even has a biblical citizenship ministry, and just kind of reading between the lines, it seems pretty congruent with white Christian nationalism, so I'm just very curious.
Has anybody else? I had not heard of that. I think you're going to have to be our reporter. Report back, Steve, after reading his posts.
I'm Tom Arnsworth. When Jemar Tisby was talking about the times in American history when Christian nationalism has has kind of swollen, and how that correlated with expansion of African American rights. The further one that he didn't mention, but I think is really significant for our time, was the presidency of Barack Obama.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's an important insight. Any other thoughts or reactions to this particular clip?
Hi, Barbara Timmer. I thought his point about when there are hard times, or when there are movements for progress, like the Black Civil Rights Movement, or I might say the Women's Rights Movement, which was around the same time, the reactions are this kind of thing. All women in church teaching can't be done, but at the same time, church membership is decreasing. So I feel like there's this clutching for power from the people that used to think they had it all. Mm-hmm. White men who could run churches and government without too many questions. And then when in the 1870s you have populism, you also have women trying to get the vote in addition to economic hardship. So I think I see a lot of this as reactions from people who correctly think that they may have less opportunity just because of who they are, just because of how they were born. They may now have a larger competitive pool. Mm-hmm. And to me, there's a lot of reaction for that, and a lot of it's economic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think if there are more thoughts, hold them for just a minute, because we're going to go on to a perfect segue to Kristin Dumais, who, by the way, is one of the people you can go hear in person. So keep an eye on that. She's a professor, I think still a professor at Calvin College, and has written some very good books. John Wayne, what is it? Jesus and John Wayne, where she looks at these Christian nationalism concepts and what she calls toxic masculinity. So let's take a listen to what she has to say. Patriarchy, misogyny, authoritarianism within the Christian nationalism. Okay.
Thank you. So as a historian, let me start off by saying that Christian nationalism is nothing new, right? And it might seem like it because the media has recently kind of discovered it. It's a handle that can help us talk about some of these patterns. But if you look at thinking that America was founded as a Christian nation, that America's laws should reflect Christian values, that true Americans are Christians, right? These are commonly held views over time, but they find expression in different ways. And so sometimes liberal Protestants are going to
try something here really quickly.
has recently kind of discovered it. It's a handle that can help us talk about some of these patterns. But if you look at thinking that America was founded as a Christian nation, that America's laws should reflect Christian values, that true Americans are Christians, right? These are commonly held views over time, but they find expression in different ways. And so sometimes liberal Protestants are going to promote these values. Black Protestants, again, in different ways. Since the 1970s, the dominant strand of Christian nationalism is that has been shaped by the Christian right. And that's really what we're talking about here for the most part, and that's what this survey is illuminating. So a couple of things have changed, though, I think. In terms of, it's only quite recently that you have people proudly self-identifying as Christian nationalists. Right? You could see some evidence of that in this survey. And people people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, most prominently. You've got folks like Andrew Torba, founder of GAB, writing a book on Christian nationalism. And inside Christian spaces and conservative evangelical spaces, we're seeing more people embrace the term. Yes, I'm a Christian nationalist. Not only am I a Christian nationalist, but all Christians ought to be Christian nationalists. True Christians are, by definition, Christian nationalists, right? This is not still the majority view, though I would say that there is still a lot of pushback inside these spaces, that those who would adhere to ideas that we label Christian nationalism will often reject the label still and say that is a smear campaign that the left is using, the media is using to smear good Christian Americans, right? And so it's a contested term inside these spaces. Just a couple of days ago, I got a letter from somebody, an email, who said exactly this. This is a smear campaign from the left. I have yet to see anybody in the media, any scholar, define Christian nationalism. Professor that I am, I responded with a couple of book suggestions and a number of links to surveys, right? He wasn't particularly receptive, but I hold out hope. When we look at surveys then, what do we see, right? We see nuance, we see variation. Not all Republicans are Christian nationalists. Not all white evangelicals are Christian nationalists. We also see variation in terms of enthusiasm, adherence, right? We have the adherents and we have the sympathizers. And these are kind of boxes, but then within those boxes, there is a range of views, there's a spectrum of levels of commitment, right? And that is really important to keep in mind. Surveys also show us what this actually means, right? What both Jemar and Pete have already surfaced here. What does this actually mean? And we can see that Christian nationalist commitments, some of these core commitments, correlate to a number where we can flesh this out. What are the contours of Christian nationalism today with respect to race and racism, with respect to immigration, with respect to patriarchy, political violence, authoritarianism, right? And we see these correlations, and we see a lot of consistency over time across various surveys. And as a historian, let me say that the data being produced by social scientists here aligns very closely with what I've seen in the historical evidence as well, right? So there's a lot of, there's a close fit here. Just last night, I got a call from a local reporter who is covering essentially a Christian nationalist takeover of a local county commission. And she's very, very sharp. She's not a Christian herself, not used to covering religion. And so she said, I just have one question I can't quite parse out. I'm not a Christian, but I've read the Christian Bible, and I don't understand what's Christian about this. Because when I look at the teachings of Jesus Christ, as Pete was saying, I don't see how it logically follows that these positions, right? And I said, that would be a really great question to put out to some of these Christian nationalist county commissioners. Right, and so there's that tension, and this surveys are going to show us what this actually means, how this is worked out. A couple of other points here. The fact that there's a lot of consistency across these surveys in terms of how this is working out in contemporary Christian nationalist circles is because these are not random commitments or kind of randomly collected agenda. There is a deeper story underneath these that defines a sense of meaning, purpose, and identity for those who hold these views. And just one example, patriarchy, gender. How does this actually work in the stories that, I'm a scholar of conservative evangelicalism, the stories that they tell themselves? It all fits together. God has created strong men, given them strength, aggression to protect faith, family, and nation. Christian nationalism turns around a sense of loss, right? Something has been lost that needs to be restored. There is a sense of threat, this us versus them, and therefore we need to fight to restore Christian America finally, what kind of threat are we looking at? I will say I'm hearing from a lot of people, not just reporters, but ordinary folks at the local level, saying this is a real threat. People are leaving, moving out of their states, moving out of school districts, and feeling this at the local level. National level, the threat to our democracy, and here I'm going to echo, I think, what Pete was suggesting, is that among adherents, there are clear anti-democratic impulses here, very clear. Democracy is held up as idolatry in some of these circles. What is more important, upholding democracy or upholding God's law, right? And the answer is clear. But that's not the case for all who lean in this direction. The commitment to democracy varies here. But as we look at what threat this actually poses, and if we look to the future, what I have my eye on is these sympathizers and precisely where their sympathies lie.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So as a historian,
So, Kristin Dumais, I hope you'll go and hear her. I surely am going to go to this little event. And I don't know if it has the time. It's 7 o'clock. I don't think it shows the time on there. But I looked it up, and I think it's 7 p.m. on November 2nd that she's going to be speaking. I think I hear in this a couple of basic things that are really important to keep in mind, especially as we think about how we interact as a Christian community with other Christians who hold beliefs that might be quite different to ours and who we might see as threatening to our views, as they see our views are threatening to theirs. The idea that Christian nationalism has a deeper story, she says. It has to do with a sense of identity, of meaning, of purpose, of seeking an orderly structure where there's God, who's then created strong men who are supposed to have dominion over women. You know, you can keep going over children, over the animals, or whatever. Powerful authorities in control are somehow seen as the saviors that will bring us back to a place where perhaps a perceived safety might be. So that's sort of what I took away from her message. And maybe you took away other things or have comments or thoughts about that. I'm eager to hear what you have to say.
Carol Artsma. I guess listening to this, I was thinking of like Iran, where the Muslims have gone hardline authoritarian, and how people are, even women are, can't have to wear, the head scarf and so forth. And so it's a human trait then, evidently, to part of maybe Calvin's original sin, for us to take a spiritual thing, God, and then to use God as a stamp for our aggression and quest for power. And it's something that evidently, we go back to the Crusades, you can go on and on and on with all the different things that go. And I guess fighting against this is a constant battle, and it gets worse every so many years, evidently.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So I'm Dave Myers. Tisby and Dumais' recounting of the long history of religion and Christian nationalism takes my mind to William James' famous phrase from the Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1901, "Piety is the mask. Piety is the mask." And I just looked up the context in which he said that, and I'm extracting this. The baiting of Jews, the stoning of Quakers and ducking of Methodists, the murdering of Mormons, the massacring of Armenians express more that inborn hatred of the alien and eccentric and non-conforming men as aliens than they express positive piety. Piety is the mask. The inner force is tribal instinct. Piety is the cover. It's the rationalization for what inwardly we feel. Modern example of that, in a very provocative pair of experiments by my social psychologist colleague Nicholas Epley at the University of Chicago, asked a variety of people, of their opinions about various social issues, and then asked them also what they thought God felt and believed about those issues. Not surprisingly at all, whatever people believed, whatever position they took, they thought God took the same position. But then the really interesting thing he did is he took one of those issues, I forget which it was, on which they didn't have deeply formed opinions, and he massively assaulted their opinion and persuaded them to change their mind. And then he asked them again what God thought. And what do you know? God changed his mind, or her mind, and now felt exactly what they believed. And so it was clearly the case that people's presumptions of what God believes and would wish for us is more a reflection, if you will, the mask that reflects our own beliefs rather than our actions and our attitudes being guided by what authentically God does believe, which is what I think God believes.
I think it's on. It's on. Yeah. It's on, Kathy. I think.
Okay. You hear me?
Oh,
There
yes,
it
we
is.
do.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, I want to know how scared to be. I'm Kathy Brownson, by the way. The things are bad. Things are really bad. And I try to keep hope. But what my overall question is, if this has happened over many, many, many years, centuries, you know, not centuries, but many years, where, yeah, you know, nationalism has risen in response to some progress by perhaps a minority or a lesser, whatever, minority group. How scared should I be now? I mean, we've come this far, and it's happening again. Mm-hmm. If we were taking this survey back in 1960, when my father was a Baptist minister, and we prayed fervently that prayer would not be taken out of the schools, and we prayed against, what was her name? Madeline? Murray? You know, she was from the devil, is what we were told. That was bad. Racism and, you know, the whole civil rights, we've come farther with that. We've come farther with women being able to vote, to be, you know, and I know that those things threaten the status quo, but we have come farther. So if we were taking this survey back in 1960, what would we see? Would we see the same percentage? Or worse? And my other observation is, if it's kind of the same, I don't think it's the same, because we've gone through a presidency where that person, I don't want to say his name, allowed these things to be said and to be spread. He gave us people the permission to be racist out loud. And he gave them, you know, the permission to be violent. You know, so, and then we also have those news media places, and we have the internet. So that makes things a lot easier to see and join. So does that make it different now? I'm just wondering, are we different now in the rise of white nationalism, or is this just another rise like we've seen in the past, and then it will go down when the threat is over? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. So how frightened should Kathy be? Anybody have some words?
Frightened enough to go and vote and invite your friends to vote in all elections. Don't take things for granted. Be one answer.
Is it worse now?
Is it worse now? Let's take a vote. How many of you think worse now than when? 1950s? Okay. How many think it's worse now than it was in the 50s? Yeah. Okay, we got a few for worse now. How many of you think? How many of you think it was worse then? Okay, and we got a lot of uncertainties out there. Okay, we're with you, Kathy. I think there's
over here. Yes.
Over there.
Hi, I'm Bill Amon. You know, I think the media is something that we've been hinting around, in that the media it's in a position, it seems, where what they're willing and wanting to share, and of course not all media, but I'm thinking the conservative media, it is not based on fact or truth to the extent that it was during my lifetime. And I'm old enough to remember Walter Cronkite, but I can't go back further than Walter. But it seems that in the past few years, and I think it corresponds with the rise of white nationalism and Donald Trump, certain media have made it a point to foster a point of view that is based on achieving certain goals of social control and of advancing white nationalism at the expense of actually sharing things that are truthful. And we have this great thing called the First Amendment, and under the law, they're protected in their speech. For me, it's a quandary. How does one push back? Especially when people, as Dr. Meyer pointed out, are very malleable in their thinking, but once they get comfortable, they sort of get stuck. And I had an interesting discussion with an acquaintance, long time acquaintance, elderly woman at Freedom Village recently, who I know is a huge lifelong fan of Disney. And I asked her what she thought of the current state of relationship between Disney and the state of Florida, because I lived in Florida in the 80s, and Disney was the crown of the state. It was the crown jewel. And her response was really interesting. She said, yes, it's those California people that messed it all up. And I wasn't surprised, but it also breaks my heart that someone's opinion could be based on something so circumstantial and uninformed, and it's just a talking point that people seem to adopt to support their opinions. And it's very difficult to have a meaningful discussion with someone who has a reference point that is that far away from, my own, and frankly, that far away from realism. Mm-hmm. So I think, in here, the media, of course, deserves some discussion, because there's some culpability there.
Thank you.
I'm Tom Arnshorst again, and it seems to me that, or I believe that the utility of fear is to, as Judy suggested, move us to do something, and to vote, but also to try to maybe to move outside our little circles of comfort, and to try to engage people with different views in a spirit of inquiry, asking more questions than giving answers, and in a spirit of respect, and just to not necessarily to change minds, but to be in conversation, and to be a source of something different, to be the change that we seek in the world.
Peg Leidens. Going back to Kathy's question, I would commend Rachel Maddow's Deja Vu, because she really does go through the history, and I think in the end she would say things were worse before. However, I saw Judy saying vote, so that's another piece we have to pay attention to. Also, our group just finished the book Stolen Focus. And I think another juxtaposition that we all have to think about is that our social media, our Facebook pages, all of those have algorithms on all of us. And it turns out, with some very careful research by this author, Jonathan Hayne, I think it is, that when you put in something like, oh, I want to watch something on the Holocaust, I want to understand the history of that, it will begin to send you into different rabbit holes, and they get more intense, and the end product is the Holocaust is a hoax. So a friend from Germany visiting this week said, oh, that happened to me. I wanted to watch something on 9/11. I know about it, but I've never watched any videos. And she said it was really interesting and seemed well documented. Then it came up and said, would you like to hear some first-hand results, first-hand witnesses of people that were part of that? And then she said suddenly, and she went down the rabbit hole and kept pressing, and listening to more and more. And then suddenly it was how the United States planned and executed 9/11 and made it happen. So she said, but I'm a critical thinker. I knew not to go there. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the newest fear. Mm-hmm.
I'm Dan Griswold, and one thing I want to commend to all of you is Professor DeMay's book. You really need to read it. It's if you come from an evangelical background, you might find it triggering. So, fair warning. The other thing I want to say is it touches somewhat on this question, this good question of are things different now than they were, say, in the 50s? Or is it better or worse? Where my mind has been going with that is a number of these markers of what constitutes white Christian nationalism, you find it affirmed in different ways by leading Christian thinkers of the last 200 years, some of them whom theologians in this room would consider ourselves to be the successors of them. So not wild people, but what I'm getting at is that these ideas seem to be part of the assumed narrative of the world, and the assumptions that people had as people of privilege for hundreds of years or more. And with theologians of that tradition these days, I'm thinking primarily the liberal Protestant tradition, we don't affirm those things anymore, so what's the difference? And I think what's the difference between that stream and, say, the Christian nationalist, white Christian nationalist group today? And I think it may be something that lies in the area of the capacity for self-critique. And so this question of what do we do, I think it's for us, not only vote and things like that, but cultivate within ourselves and our peers the capacity for self-critique.
Mm-hmm. I also think about what Parker Palmer talked about what truth is. And he said, truth is the eternal conversation conducted with passion and discipline about things that matter. And for me, what that meant is, unless you're talking to yourself, that conversation is with others. And for me, that basically means no one person holds the truth, that it always has to be in dialogue and conversation with the people around us, and if we're wise, seeking out people who are, as someone has said, outside of our bubble. But how you have that conversation is something I think we especially want to talk about next week as well. Judy?
I'm Judy Vanderbilt. I have just a quick comment. Would it be appropriate also to call this white, patriarchal, Christian nationalism?
Amen, sister. No, because it's very much built on that kind of thing. Now, it doesn't mean that every Christian nationalist believes that men should be in charge, that women should be silent, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a strong correlation between those beliefs and looking for that kind of authority.
Barbara Timmer again. In the 1980s, I was having lunch with someone that I thought was quite old, and I think she's probably my age, but and she said when she was a little girl, her father was in the House of Representatives. He came home they were having dinner that night, and she was probably 10 or something, I don't know. It was during the 50s. And she said something, well, how was work today, Daddy, or something? And he said, well, it was a tough one. He said, we had a hard vote. We voted on a Pledge of Allegiance. And they wanted to put in under Jesus Christ our Lord. And we reached a compromise under God. So, you know, this is a recurring theme, but I'll say the other thing is, to me, money. Every time you click on something, somebody makes money. And we talk about the leaders who are spewing hate, and their followers who send them $10, but the real money is coming from real organizations that make a lot of money from discrimination and caste. And if you look at the Supreme Court decisions, the ones that make a difference, we think they're about gender and religion. The ones that are making a big difference are about money. And what I would like to ask Kristin, I know she's writing a second book now, I'd like a third book. The other side of the coin is money. And they like it, I think, when we focus on the crazy leaders. I think they like that. They don't want us tracking down where did Leonard Leo get the $1.6 billion. That's too tricky, and it involves the IRS. Anyway, I hope it's not worse, but it might be very similar.
It's not just money, it's dark money. Where is it coming from? There was a book, a nonfiction, Dark Money. It came out about 5 years ago, recommended. I can't remember the author.
There's someone back there?
Sam Martin. I guess I've been pondering this question of, was it worse in the 50s or is it worse now? And I guess what I'm thinking is that it's not a very good question. The valid question, I think, is it okay now? And the answer to that is no, from my perspective. So, which gets us right back to I think we're going to talk about next week, which is what do we do about it?
And I think the question also is better for whom? Better for whom in the 50s versus now? And if you're looking at that, then the critique from women, from people of color, from other groups is very clear. No, it wasn't better back then than it is now. And your comment is very well taken. Where do we want to go from here?
So most people didn't raise their hand, is it worse today than it was? But it depends on what we mean by worse. If we're talking about attitudes about race, gender, climate, sexual orientation, there's a whole, it's much better from our perspective, from what I know is Kathy Brownson's perspective today, and it's headed in a positive direction, so there's great reason for optimism. But as has been pointed out here in some of the very excellent comments, if we're talking about polarization and misinformation and what feeds that, we're in a much worse place today because we're in separate tribes with separate information sources rather than Walter Cronkite teaching us all. And there's massive data to support both those conclusions. So it's both much better and much worse.
One comment over there? Or no? Okay. Before going on our wine tour, we went on a Rhodes Scholar trip to Croatia. And Croatia is former Yugoslavia, huge, huge ethnic, cultural clashes that get wrapped up in religion. So it's the Eastern Orthodox against the Russian Orthodox. It's the Muslims, all of these. And interestingly, when they did surveys, they found that people strongly identified with, well, I'm Eastern Orthodox. More people identified with a specific religion than believed in God. when they ask them. So I'm Eastern Orthodox. Do I believe in God? Not really, no. So I think it's a lot of what Dave has been saying about, mentioned about the mask, what we put on, and what was, that these symbols can be used to wrap up the ideologies, the power struggles, what we see in terms of gaining power. Thank you so much for an excellent, excellent conversation. Let me just quickly conclude here. If I can find my arrows. So things to keep in mind. How do we undertake the conversation with people in our community, both our church community and broader community, who hold different views? What does it look like to build a strategy of reconciliation for Hope Church in these? And a reminder of next week that we will be beginning to continue to tackle these issues and bringing them home, to talk more about what's here. Also, I haven't reported to you on how our group responded to some of the questions about race, about structural racism and so on. And those we can take a look at as well. I think you'll find them quite interesting. Let me just quickly close us in prayer. Holy Spirit, precious God, you are in and through everything. When we are silent, when we take a moment to listen for that still small voice, we can hear you. Be with us as we take on these difficult issues, especially because they're within the part of your loving, beloved community that we call Christian, to be able to have the voices and the conversations that seek your truth, that seek your beloved community, and that for us, that we can be Christ followers. We pray all this in Christ's name. Amen. Thank you.